You should know what happened this 1354 and why it is the most important event in history. The Shroud of Turin, a mysterious linen cloth bearing the haunting, negative image of a crucified man, was first publicly displayed in France, igniting a debate that would burn across centuries, challenge science, shake faith, and remain unresolved to this very day. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Now, imagine standing in a small wooden church in the French countryside. The year is 1354. Europe is still reeling from the Black Death, a plague that swept across the continent just a few years earlier and killed anywhere from a third to half of the entire population. Feudal lords cling to power. The 100 Years' War between England and France grinds on with no end in sight. The papacy itself is fractured, with rival claimants battling for the throne of St. Peter. And into this world of chaos, suffering, and desperate faith, a single piece of linen cloth emerges, a cloth that its owners claim once wrapped the broken, bloodied body of Jesus Christ himself. This is not merely the story of a piece of fabric. This is the story of the most studied, most debated, most controversial artifact in human history. This is a story that spans 2,000 years of belief, 700 years of documented history, and decades of the most advanced scientific testing ever applied to a single object. And after all of that, after all the carbon dating, all the forensic analysis, all the microscopic examination, all the theological argument, we still do not have a definitive answer. We still do not know with absolute certainty what this cloth is, how the image upon it was formed, or whether it truly once cradled the body of the most influential figure in the history of civilization. This is the Shroud of Turin, and this is a story you need to hear. Let us begin at the beginning, not the beginning of the shroud's documented history, but the beginning of the story that gives this cloth its meaning. Because you cannot understand the Shroud of Turin without understanding the event it claims to represent. You cannot grasp why this artifact has consumed the minds of scientists, historians, theologians, artists, skeptics, and believers for centuries without first understanding the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. According to the accounts preserved in the four Gospels of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus of Nazareth was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane on the outskirts of Jerusalem, likely in the year 30 or 33 of the Common Era. He was brought before the Jewish authorities, questioned, and then handed over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. After a series of interrogations and a public trial, Pilate sentenced Jesus to death by crucifixion, the most brutal, most humiliating form of execution in the Roman world. Before the crucifixion itself, Jesus was scourged. Roman scourging was not a simple beating. It was a systematic destruction of the human body. The instrument used was called a flagrum, a short whip with multiple leather thongs, each tipped with small pieces of bone or metal. The victim was typically stripped and tied to a post, and soldiers would take turns lashing the back, the buttocks, and the legs. The flagrum would tear through skin, rip into muscle, and in severe cases expose the underlying bone. Victims of Roman scourging frequently went into shock. Some died from the scourging alone before they ever reached the cross. After the scourging, the Gospels tell us that Roman soldiers placed a crown of thorns upon Jesus' head, a cruel mockery of his claim to kingship. They dressed him in a purple robe, spat upon him, and struck him across the face. Then they led him through the streets of Jerusalem, forcing him to carry the horizontal beam of his own cross, the patibulum, to the place of execution, a hill called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. At Golgotha, Jesus was nailed to the cross. Iron spikes were driven through his wrists and his feet. The cross was raised upright, and Jesus hung there, suspended between heaven and earth, for hours. Crucifixion killed slowly. The victim did not bleed to death from the nail wounds. Instead, death came through a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, shock, and ultimately asphyxiation. As the body weakened, the victim could no longer push upward against the nails in the feet to draw breath. The lungs filled with fluid, the heart gave out. It was a death designed to be as prolonged, as agonizing, and as public as possible. The The Gospels record that Jesus died after approximately 6 hours on the cross. To confirm his death, a Roman soldier thrust a spear into his side. The Gospel of John specifies the right side, and blood and water flowed out. Medical experts have since interpreted this detail as evidence of a pleural effusion, a buildup of fluid around the lungs and heart, which is entirely consistent with the kind of trauma that crucifixion inflicts upon the human body. After Jesus' death, the Gospels tell us that a wealthy follower named Joseph of Arimathea went to Pontius Pilate and asked for permission to take down the body. Pilate granted the request. Joseph, along with another follower named Nicodemus, removed the body from the cross, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in a newly hewn tomb carved into rock. A large stone was rolled across the entrance, and here is where the shroud enters the story. Because the cloth that Joseph of Arimathea used to wrap the body of Jesus, that clean linen shroud, is what believers claim is the very same piece of fabric that now rests in a silver reliquary in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. But is it? That is the question. That has always been the question. Before we trace the documented history of the shroud, we need to understand what we are actually looking at when we look at this cloth. Because the Shroud of Turin is not simply a piece of old linen. It is an object that defies easy explanation, and the image upon it has characteristics that remain, to this day, scientifically unexplained. The shroud is a rectangular piece of linen cloth, measuring approximately 14 feet 3 inches long and 3 feet 7 inches wide. It is woven in a 3-to-1 herringbone twill pattern, a weave that was known in the ancient world, but was also used in the medieval period. The cloth is old, it is yellowed with age. It bears the marks of fire, water, and centuries of handling. But the remarkable thing about the shroud is the image. On the surface of the linen, there is a faint, straw-yellow discoloration that forms the front and back image of a naked human male. The figure appears to be lying flat, with hands crossed over the lower abdomen, and the image shows both the front of the body and the back of the body, as if the cloth had been draped over the head and laid beneath and above the body, exactly as burial shrouds were used in the ancient Jewish tradition. The figure on the shroud shows a man who is approximately 5 feet 11 inches to 6 feet tall. He is bearded. His hair appears to be long, falling to his shoulders. His body shows evidence of extensive trauma that is remarkably consistent with the gospel accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus. There are marks on the back that are consistent with severe scourging, dozens of dumbbell-shaped wounds that match the pattern a Roman flagrum would leave. There are puncture wounds around the scalp, consistent with a cap or crown of thorns. There are abrasions on the shoulders, consistent with carrying a heavy beam. There are wounds in the wrists, not the palms, as medieval art always depicted, but the wrists, in a location that anatomists confirm is the only place where a nail could support the weight of a hanging body without tearing through the flesh. There is a wound in the side between the ribs, consistent with a spear thrust, and the blood-stained patterns around this wound show evidence of both blood and a clear, watery fluid, exactly what the Gospel of John describes. There are wounds in the feet, consistent with a single nail driven through both feet, one on top of the other. The knees show abrasions, as if the man had fallen repeatedly. The face shows swelling and bruising, as if the man had been struck. Every single wound on this cloth corresponds to the gospel narrative. Every single detail of the trauma matches what we know about Roman crucifixion practices from historical and archaeological evidence. And here's the crucial detail. Many of these details were unknown to medieval artists and scholars. The nailing through the wrists rather than the palms, for example, was not understood until modern anatomical studies. A medieval forger would almost certainly have placed the nail wounds in the palms, as every medieval painting and sculpture does, but the shroud does not. The shroud places them in the anatomically correct position. This alone does not prove the shroud is authentic. But it raises a profound question. If this is a medieval forgery, how did the forger know things that medieval science and art did not know? But the anatomical accuracy of the wounds is only the beginning of the mystery, because the image on the shroud has properties that are, frankly, bewildering. The first and most famous of these properties was discovered in 1898 when an Italian photographer named Secondo was given permission to photograph the shroud for the first time. Paya set up his camera in the cathedral, took his photographs, and then went to his darkroom to develop the glass plate negatives. And when he looked at the negative image, the reversed image on the glass plate, he nearly dropped it in shock, because the negative of the shroud photograph showed a positive image. The image on the shroud, Paya realized, was itself a photographic negative. When you reverse the light and dark values, a stunningly detailed, realistic portrait of a man emerges from the cloth. The face that appears in the photographic negative is haunting, serene, dignified, bearing the marks of suffering, but composed in what appears to be death or peaceful rest. It is a face that once seen is never forgotten. Think about what this means. The image on the shroud is a negative image. Light areas on the cloth correspond to dark areas on the body, and dark areas on the cloth correspond to light areas. This is exactly how a photograph works, but the shroud predates the invention of photography by at least 500 years and possibly by 2,000 years. No medieval artist painted in negative. No medieval artist could have conceived of a negative image, because the very concept of a photographic negative did not exist until the 19th century. And even if a medieval artist had somehow stumbled upon the idea of painting in reversed tonal values, the result would not have looked like anything recognizable to the naked eye. It would have appeared as a meaningless pattern of light and dark patches. Only when the image is photographically reversed does the portrait emerge in its full, startling clarity. This discovery sent shockwaves through both the scientific and religious communities. For believers, it seemed like powerful evidence that the shroud was genuine, that no human hand could have created such an image. For skeptics, it was a puzzle, but surely, they argued, there must be a rational human explanation. And so the investigation began, and it has never stopped. Over the course of the 20th century, the Shroud of Turin was subjected to an extraordinary array of scientific tests and examinations. Physicists, chemists, biologists, forensic pathologists, textile experts, art historians, and specialists in fields ranging from botany to nuclear physics have studied this cloth, and the results of their studies have only deepened the mystery. Let us begin with the image itself. What is the image on the shroud? How was it formed? The first thing scientists discovered is that the image is not painted. There's no pigment, no dye, no ink, no stain applied to the surface of the cloth in the image areas. Microscopic examination reveals that the image is formed by a discoloration of the outermost fibers of the linen threads. The discoloration affects only the very top layer of each fiber, a layer estimated to be approximately 200 nanometers thick. That is 200 billionths of a meter. That is thinner than a single bacterium. The discoloration appears to be the result of a chemical change in the cellulose of the linen fibers, an accelerated aging process that turned the fibers a slightly darker shade of yellow compared to the surrounding non-image fibers. But what caused this chemical change? That is the question that no one has been able to answer. The image has no directionality. When you apply paint to a surface, you leave brush strokes. You leave evidence of the direction of application. The shroud image has none of this. There are no brush strokes, no application marks, no evidence of any liquid or paste being applied to the cloth in any direction. The image has no saturation point. When you apply paint or dye to fabric, the substance soaks into the threads and spreads through the fibers by capillary action. The shroud image shows no evidence of capillary flow. The discoloration does not penetrate into the threads. It does not spread from fiber to fiber within a thread. Each individual fiber is either discolored or it is not. The image is formed by varying the number of discolored fibers per unit area, rather than by varying the intensity of a coloring substance on each fiber. The image is superficial. It exists only on the topmost fibers of the cloth. If you were to scrape the discolored layer off, the fibers underneath would be perfectly white, perfectly normal linen. The image does not penetrate through the cloth. It does not soak through. When the reverse side of the shroud was examined, during a rare conservation effort in 2002, the back of the cloth showed no image whatsoever, except for a very faint image of the face. The image contains three-dimensional information. In 1976, two scientists working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory used a device called a VP8 image analyzer, an instrument designed to convert the brightness values of a photograph into height values, creating a three-dimensional relief map. When they fed a photograph of the shroud into the VP8, something extraordinary happened. The image converted into a perfect three-dimensional relief of a human body. The brightness values of the shroud image corresponded directly and proportionally to the distance between the cloth and the body surface beneath it. No painting, no photograph, no artistic reproduction of any kind does this. When you put a normal photograph into a VP8 image analyzer, you get a distorted, meaningless jumble of shapes. When you put a painting into the VP8, you get the same distorted result. Only the shroud image produces a coherent three-dimensional form. The image encodes information about the distance between the cloth and the body it covered, information that no human artist could have embedded in a two-dimensional image. This three-dimensional property means that the image was not formed by contact alone. If the image were formed simply by the cloth touching a body coated in some substance, the image would appear only in the areas of direct contact, and all contact areas would have the same intensity. But the shroud image varies in intensity based on cloth to body distance, even in areas where the cloth was not in direct contact with the skin. The image appears to have been formed by some kind of process that acted across a distance, some kind of radiation or energy that decreased in intensity with distance from the body surface. What kind of process could do this? What kind of energy could discolor the outermost 200 nanometers of linen fibers in a way that encodes three-dimensional distance information without penetrating deeper into the cloth? That is the question that has baffled scientists for decades, and no one, not a single researcher, believer, or skeptic, has been able to reproduce the image using any known technology, medieval or modern. The blood on the shroud adds another layer of complexity to the mystery. Unlike the body image, the blood on the shroud is not a discoloration of the linen fibers. It is actual material applied to the surface, and extensive testing has confirmed that this material is, in fact, real blood. In the 1970s and 1980s, researchers conducted a series of chemical tests on the blood stains. They found hemoglobin, they found albumin, they found immunoglobulin antibodies that are found only in blood. They found porphyrins, the chemical compounds that give blood its red color. The blood tested positive for human blood, specifically type AB, a relatively rare blood type that is most common in the Middle East. But here's the remarkable detail: the blood was on the cloth before the image was formed. Microscopic examination reveals that wherever there is a blood stain, there is no body image beneath it. The blood acted as a mask, preventing the image-forming process from affecting the fibers underneath. This means that whatever process created the image, it happened after the blood was already on the cloth. If the shroud were a painting, this would make no sense. No artist paints the blood first and then somehow creates a full body image around the blood stains without disturbing them. The bloodstain patterns themselves have been studied by forensic pathologists, and the results are deeply significant. The blood flows are consistent with a body that was in a vertical position, hanging on a cross, and then transferred to a horizontal position after death. The patterns show evidence of venous blood and arterial blood, which flow differently due to differences in pressure. The blood flows from the wrist wounds show two distinct angles, approximately 65 degrees and 55 degrees from the vertical, which is consistent with a crucified person shifting between two positions on the cross in an effort to breathe. The blood around the scalp shows dozens of individual puncture wounds, with blood flows that follow the contours of the head in a pattern consistent with gravity flowing downward from puncture points and following the natural channels formed by the muscles and bones of the skull. The pattern is not consistent with a crown in the traditional sense, a circlet worn around the forehead, but rather with a cap of thorns covering the entire top of the head. This is significant because early Christian tradition, though not explicitly stated in the Gospels, described the crown of thorns as a cap rather than a circlet. Most medieval art shows a circlet, the shroud shows a cap. Once again, the shroud diverges from medieval convention and aligns with earlier historical tradition. The wound in the side, the spear wound, shows a large bloodstain with a clear separation between red blood cells and a clear, yellowish fluid. This separation, known as sedimentation, occurs naturally when blood is allowed to stand after death. It is consistent with post-mortem blood flow and with the Gospel account of blood and water flowing from the wound. A medieval forger would have had no understanding of post-mortem blood separation. This is a detail that was not understood until modern forensic science. Now let us turn to the history. Because while the science of the shroud is fascinating and deeply puzzling, the history is what grounds this story in the real world. And the history of the Shroud of Turin begins, as far as documented evidence is concerned, in a small town in northern France in the year 1354. The town was Lirey. It was a modest place, a rural community in the Champagne region, and it was the home of a minor French nobleman named Geoffroi de Charny. Geoffroi was a knight, a warrior, and by the standards of his time, a man of considerable valor and piety. He had fought in the 100 Years' War, had been captured by the English and held for ransom, and had been involved in a failed crusade to recapture the city of Smyrna from the Turks. He was a man who had seen suffering, who had endured imprisonment, and who had devoted himself to the ideals of Christian chivalry. In the early 1350s, Geoffroi de Charny founded a small collegiate church in Lirey, a church served by a group of canons or priests who would celebrate regular services and pray for the souls of the faithful. And it was in this church around 1354 or 1355 that the shroud was first publicly displayed. The records from this period are sparse, but we know that the shroud attracted attention almost immediately. Pilgrims began coming to Lirey to see the cloth. The canons of the church displayed it prominently, and the faithful venerated it as the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. It was a sensation, a relic of unparalleled significance, appearing seemingly out of nowhere in a small French village, but not everyone was convinced, and the first recorded skeptic was a man of considerable authority, Pierre d'Arcis, the Bishop of Troyes. In 1389, Bishop d'Arcis wrote a furious letter to Pope Clement VII, demanding that the display of the shroud be stopped. In this letter, which is one of the most important documents in shroud history, d'Arcis made several explosive claims. He stated that a predecessor of his, Bishop Henry de Poitiers, had investigated the shroud decades earlier and had discovered the truth. The shroud was a forgery. According to d'Arcis, Henry de Poitiers had found the artist who painted it, and the artist had confessed. This letter has been cited by shroud skeptics ever since as definitive proof that the shroud is a medieval fake, but there are significant problems with this claim. The first problem is that Bishop d'Arcis does not name the artist. He does not provide any details about who this person was, what techniques they used, or how they created the image. He simply asserts that an artist was found and a confession was obtained. The second problem is that no corroborating evidence for this investigation has ever been found. There are no court records, no testimony transcripts, no documents of any kind from Bishop Henry de Poitiers' investigation that confirm d'Arcis's account. In fact, Henry de Poitiers is known to have had a generally cordial relationship with Geoffroi de Charny, which seems inconsistent with d'Arcis's claim that Henry had denounced the shroud as a fraud. The third problem is that Bishop d'Arcis had a clear motive for opposing the shroud's display. The pilgrim traffic to Lirey was drawing the faithful and their donations away from the cathedral at Troyes. The bishop was losing revenue. His opposition may have been driven as much by economics as by theology. Pope Clement VII responded to d'Arcis's letter with a compromise that reveals a great deal about the political complexities of the situation. The Pope did not condemn the shroud as a forgery, nor did he authenticate it as a genuine relic. Instead, he ruled that the shroud could continue to be displayed, but it must be described as a likeness or representation of the burial shroud of Christ, rather than as the actual shroud. He also imposed silence on Bishop Darcis, threatening him with excommunication if he continued to agitate against the cloth. This papal ruling is fascinating because it reveals the Church's own ambivalence about the shroud, an ambivalence that persists to this day. The Church has never officially declared the shroud to be authentic, but neither has it declared it to be a forgery. It has always occupied a careful middle ground, allowing the faithful to venerate the shroud as an object of devotion without requiring them to believe it is genuine. But how did Geoffroi de Charny come to possess the shroud in the first place? This is one of the great unanswered questions of shroud history, and the gap in the historical record has given rise to a rich tapestry of theories, speculations, and alternative histories. Geoffroi de Charny never publicly explained how he obtained the cloth. He died in battle at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, just 2 years after the shroud's first public display, and he left no written account of the cloth's provenance. His family maintained possession of the shroud after his death, but they too offered no clear explanation of its origins. This silence is itself significant. In the medieval world, relics were enormously valuable, both spiritually and financially. A relic as significant as the burial shroud of Christ would have been the most prized possession in all of Christendom. Its provenance, the chain of custody tracing it back to the tomb of Jesus, would have been its most important attribute. Any legitimate owner of such a relic would have been eager to establish and publicize its provenance. The fact that Geoffroi de Charny did not do so suggests one of two possibilities. Either he obtained the cloth through channels that he could not or would not reveal, perhaps through looting, theft, or secretive private transaction, or the cloth did not have a legitimate provenance because it was not what it claimed to be. Supporters of the shroud's authenticity have proposed several theories to fill this gap. The most prominent of these involves the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar were a powerful military religious order founded in the early 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Over the course of 2 centuries, the Templars grew into one of the most wealthy and influential organizations in medieval Europe. They owned vast estates, operated an international banking system, and maintained a network of fortified commanderies across the continent. They were also rumored to possess sacred relics of extraordinary power, relics that they kept hidden from the outside world. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars and covetous of their wealth, orchestrated a sudden, coordinated arrest of all Templars in France. The knights were charged with heresy, blasphemy, and a catalogue of other offenses. Under torture, many confessed to bizarre practices, including the worship of a mysterious bearded head, an idol known as Baphomet. The Templars were suppressed, their leaders were burned at the stake, and their assets were seized. Now here is where the connection to the shroud becomes intriguing. Among the charges leveled against the Templars was the claim that they worshipped a mysterious bearded head or face. Some researchers have proposed that this head was not an idol at all, but the Shroud of Turin, folded and displayed so that only the face was visible. When folded in this manner, the shroud does indeed show only a disembodied face, a bearded male face that could easily be mistaken for some kind of icon or idol by those unfamiliar with the full cloth. Furthermore, the family of Geoffroi de Charny had connections to the Templars. A man named Geoffroi de Charny, note the slightly different spelling, was the preceptor of Normandy for the Knights Templar and was burned at the stake alongside the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, in 1314. Some researchers believe that this Geoffroi de Charny was a relative of the Geoffroi de Charny who later displayed the shroud, possibly an uncle or great-uncle. If so, the theory goes, the shroud may have been a Templar treasure that was secretly passed from the doomed order to the family of one of its martyred leaders, eventually surfacing decades later in Lirey. This theory is compelling but unproven. The genealogical connection between the two Geoffroi has been debated by historians, and there is no direct documentary evidence linking the Templars to the shroud. It remains a tantalizing possibility, a a thread that connects several historical dots but falls short of definitive proof. Other researchers have proposed a different history for the shroud, one that traces it not through the Templars but through the Byzantine Empire and before that, through the ancient city of Edessa in what is now southeastern Turkey. This theory revolves around an object known as the image of Edessa or the Mandylion. According to ancient Christian tradition, King Abgar V of Edessa, a historical figure who ruled in the 1st century, was afflicted with a terrible disease. He heard of Jesus of Nazareth and his miraculous healings, and he sent a messenger to Jesus, begging him to come to Edessa and cure him. Jesus, according to the tradition, could not come in person, but he pressed his face against a cloth and miraculously imprinted his image upon it. This cloth, the Mandylion, was sent to Abgar, who was healed upon seeing it. The Mandylion was described in ancient sources as a cloth bearing the image of a face not made by human hands. It was kept in Edessa for centuries, hidden at times within the city walls, and it became one of the most revered relics in the Eastern Christian world. In 944, the Byzantine Emperor Romanos I sent an army to Edessa and demanded the surrender of the Mandylion. The cloth was brought to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, where it was kept in the imperial chapel and displayed on special occasions. Now here's the critical question. Was the Mandylion actually the Shroud of Turin, folded to show only the face? Several pieces of evidence support this theory. First, when the Mandylion was transferred to Constantinople, a sermon delivered at the time described it in unusual terms. Preacher Gregory Referendarius stated that the cloth bore not only the image of a face, but also the image of the outlines of the side, a detail that makes no sense for a small face cloth but makes perfect sense for a full-length burial shroud that had been folded to display only the face. Second, artistic representations of the Mandylion show a face that is strikingly similar to the face on the shroud. The same long, narrow features, the same forked beard, the same intense, forward-looking gaze. Art historians have noted that the conventional depiction of Jesus in Byzantine art changed dramatically after the Mandylion arrived in Constantinople. Before the 10th century, Jesus was depicted in a variety of ways, sometimes young and beardless, sometimes older and bearded, with no consistent facial type. After the 10th century, a standardized image emerged, a long-faced, bearded man with a distinctive appearance that closely matches the face on the shroud. Some researchers believe that the Mandylion, which was actually the folded shroud, served as the prototype for this standardized image. Third, when the Crusaders sacked Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, numerous sacred relics were looted from the city. A French knight named Robert de Clary wrote an account of the sack and mentioned seeing, in one of the city's churches, the sidon, the word for shroud, in which our Lord had been wrapped, which every Friday raised itself upright so that the figure of our Lord could be plainly seen there. After the sack, de Clary wrote, no one, either Greek or French, ever knew what became of this sidon. This account places a full-length burial shroud of Christ in Constantinople before 1204, which was then lost during the looting. If this shroud was the Mandylion re-identified as a full burial cloth rather than a face cloth, then the chain of custody extends from Edessa in the 1st century to Constantinople in 944, and from Constantinople to an unknown location after 1204, eventually surfacing in Lirey, France in 1354. The gap between 1204 and 1354, 150 years, could be explained by the Templar connection, with the knights bringing the cloth from Constantinople to their strongholds in France, where it eventually passed to the family of Geoffroi de Charny. This is an elegant theory and it has won many adherents, but it must be stated clearly, it is still a theory. Each link in the chain is plausible, but none is proven beyond doubt. The identification of the Mandylion with the shroud, the connection between the Constantinople shroud and the Templar idol, and the genealogical link between the Templar Geoffroi de Charny and the Lirey Geoffroi de Charny, all of these remain subjects of scholarly debate. Let us now turn to one of the most contentious chapters in the entire shroud story, the carbon dating of 1988. For decades, scientists had wanted to subject the shroud to radiocarbon dating, a technique that measures the decay of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope present in all organic materials, to determine the age of a sample. Carbon-14 decays at a known rate, and by measuring how much carbon-14 remains in a sample, scientists can estimate when the organism, in this case, the flax plant from which the linen was made, died. The Catholic Church, which had been the custodian of the shroud since 1983 when the former royal house of Savoy bequeathed it, was initially reluctant to allow carbon dating. The test would require cutting a piece of the cloth, a destructive procedure that could not be undone. But eventually, under pressure from the scientific community and with growing public interest, the Church agreed. In April 1988, a small strip of cloth was cut from one corner of the shroud, the lower left corner, away from the main image. The sample was divided into portions and distributed to 3 independent laboratories: the University of Oxford in England, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. Each laboratory conducted its tests independently, using the accelerator mass spectrometry method, and each laboratory was also given control samples of known age to ensure the accuracy of their equipment and procedures. The results were announced on October 13, 1988, at a press conference in London. The 3 laboratories were in agreement. The Shroud of Turin, they concluded, dated to between 1260 and 1390, the medieval period. The flax from which the linen was made had been harvested sometime during those 130 years. The results were published in the prestigious scientific journal Nature in February 1989, and the paper concluded with the statement, "The results provide conclusive evidence that the linen of the Shroud of Turin is medieval." For many people, this was the end of the story. The shroud was a medieval forgery. The carbon dating had spoken. Science had delivered its verdict. But for others, and not only believers, the carbon dating raised more questions than it answered, because the medieval date created a paradox. If the shroud was made between 1260 and 1390, then who made it and how? Remember what we know about the image. It is not painted. It is not dyed. It contains no pigment, no ink, no applied substance of any kind. It is a superficial discoloration of the outermost fibers, only 200 nanometers deep. It is a photographic negative. It contains 3-dimensional distance information. It shows anatomical and forensic details that were unknown in the medieval period. The blood on it is real human blood, applied before the image was formed. If a medieval artist created this image, they used a technique that no one has ever been able to identify, let alone replicate. Despite decades of attempts, no one, not a single scientist, artist, or technician, has been able to create a full-size reproduction of the shroud image that matches all of its known properties. Individual properties can be partially replicated, but the complete combination of characteristics has never been reproduced, and so the carbon dating, rather than settling the debate, intensified it. Because now there were 2 seemingly irreconcilable sets of facts: the science of the image, which suggested something far beyond medieval capability, and the carbon dating, which placed the cloth squarely in the medieval period. How could both be true? In the years since 1988, numerous challenges to the carbon dating have been raised. Some of these challenges are more credible than others, and we will examine the most significant ones. The first challenge concerns the location from which the sample was taken. The sample was cut from the lower left corner of the shroud, an area that has been extensively handled over the centuries. This is the area where the cloth was grasped when it was held up for display, and it is also an area where medieval repairs are known to have been made. In 2005, a chemist named Raymond Rogers, who had been part of the original team that examined the shroud in 1978, published a paper in the peer-reviewed journal Thermochimica Acta, in which he presented evidence that the carbon dating sample was not representative of the rest of the shroud. Rogers examined fibers from the carbon dating sample area and found that they contained cotton fibers interwoven with the linen cotton that was not present in the main body of the cloth. He also found evidence of a dye, alizarin, coating the fibers in the sample area, a dye that was commonly used in the Middle Ages to color fabric. Rogers concluded that the corner from which the carbon dating sample was taken had been repaired at some point, probably during the medieval period, using a technique known as invisible reweaving or French reweaving, in which new threads are skillfully interwoven with the original fabric in such a way that the repair is virtually undetectable to the naked eye. If the carbon dating sample contained a significant proportion of newer medieval threads interwoven with the original ancient threads, then the radiocarbon date would be a mixture of two ages, producing a date that was somewhere between the true age of the original cloth and the age of the repair material. This hypothesis was controversial, and it was disputed by some scientists. But Rogers's paper was peer-reviewed and published in a reputable journal, and his findings have been supported by subsequent research. Textile experts have confirmed that invisible reweaving was a known and practiced technique in the medieval period, and microscopic analysis of the sample area has revealed differences in weave structure and fiber composition compared to the main body of the shroud. If Rogers is correct, then the 1988 carbon dating did not date the shroud. It dated a medieval repair patch, and the true age of the cloth remains unknown. A second challenge to the carbon dating involves the effects of contamination. The shroud has been through a great deal over the centuries. It has been displayed in smoky churches, handled by countless people, exposed to fire and water, and kept in conditions that were far from ideal for the preservation of organic material. In 1532, the shroud was nearly destroyed in a fire at the chapel in Chambéry, France, where it was then being kept. The silver reliquary in which the shroud was stored was heated to the point that molten silver dripped onto the folded cloth, burning through multiple layers. Water was thrown on the reliquary to extinguish the fire, soaking the cloth. The shroud survived, but it bears the scars of this event, symmetrical burn marks and water stains that run along both sides of the image. Some researchers have argued that the fire of 1532 could have altered the carbon-14 content of the cloth, making it appear younger than it actually is. When linen is heated, the chemical bonds in the cellulose can break and reform, potentially incorporating carbon from the surrounding environment, carbon that could have a different carbon-14 ratio than the original material. Additionally, the water used to extinguish the fire could have deposited dissolved minerals and organic compounds on the cloth, further altering its carbon content. Others have pointed to biological contamination as a factor. In 1982, a microbiologist named Leoncio Garza Valdez discovered a bioplastic coating on the shroud fibers, a thin, transparent layer of organic material produced by bacteria and fungi that had colonized the surface of the cloth over the centuries. This bioplastic coating, Garza Valdez argued, would contain carbon from a much later period than the original linen, and it would be extremely difficult to remove using the standard cleaning procedures employed by the radiocarbon dating laboratories. If the bioplastic coating was not adequately removed, it would skew the carbon date toward a more recent period. The radiocarbon laboratories that dated the shroud have insisted that their cleaning procedures were thorough and that contamination was not a significant factor. But critics point out that the standard cleaning protocols may not have been sufficient to remove a bioplastic coating that was chemically bonded to the surface of the fibers. This remains a disputed issue. A third challenge to the carbon dating is perhaps the most intriguing and the most speculative. It involves the very process by which the image was formed. If, as some researchers have proposed, the image on the shroud was created by a burst of radiation, ultraviolet light, or some form of nuclear radiation, then this radiation could have altered the carbon-14 content of the cloth. Specifically, neutron radiation could convert nitrogen-14 atoms in the linen into carbon-14 atoms through a well-known nuclear reaction. This would increase the amount of carbon-14 in the cloth, making it appear younger than it actually is. This hypothesis, proposed by physicist John Jackson and others, suggests that the very event that created the image, whatever that event was, also corrupted the carbon dating. If the image was formed by a burst of radiation at the moment of the resurrection, as believers have proposed, then the resurrection itself would have made accurate carbon dating impossible. This is, of course, a hypothesis that cannot be tested. You cannot subject a miraculous event to laboratory analysis, but it illustrates the extraordinary complexity of the Shroud debate and the way in which the scientific and the theological are inextricably intertwined in this story. Let us step back now and consider the broader context of relics in the medieval world, because the Shroud did not emerge in a vacuum. It appeared in a culture that was saturated with relics, sacred objects associated with Jesus, the Virgin Mary, the Apostles, and the Saints. And many of these relics were, frankly, fraudulent. Medieval Europe was awash in false relics. There were enough fragments of the true cross to build a ship. There were multiple heads of John the Baptist. There were vials of the Virgin Mary's breast milk, feathers from the wings of the Archangel Gabriel, and jars containing the breath of Jesus. The market for relics was enormous, and where there is demand, there will be supply, much of it fraudulent. Relics served multiple purposes in medieval society. They were objects of devotion and veneration, believed to possess miraculous healing powers. They were symbols of prestige and authority. A church that possessed a major relic could attract pilgrims, generate revenue, and enhance its reputation. And they were political tools. Kings, bishops, and popes used relics to legitimize their authority and advance their agendas. The trade in relics was big business. Professional relic dealers traveled across Europe and the Middle East, acquiring or manufacturing sacred objects for sale to churches, monasteries, and private collectors. Some of these dealers were sincere believers who genuinely thought they were dealing in authentic relics. Others were outright fraudsters who knew perfectly well that the objects they sold were fakes. In this context, the emergence of a burial shroud of Christ in a small French village is not, on its face, particularly surprising. It fits the pattern of medieval relic claims. A minor nobleman acquires a spectacular relic, displays it in his private church, attracts pilgrims and donations, and boosts his family's prestige and income. The local bishop objects, a controversy ensues, and the Pope steps in to broker a compromise. If this were the whole story, we could dismiss the Shroud as just another medieval fake and move on. But it is not the whole story, because the image on the Shroud is unlike anything else in the medieval relic tradition. Every other claimed burial cloth of Christ from the medieval period is either blank, no image, or bears a crudely painted figure that is obviously the work of a human artist. The Shroud of Turin is the only burial cloth in history that bears an image with the extraordinary properties we have described. It is in a category entirely by itself, and this is the core of the mystery. If the Shroud is a medieval forgery, it is a forgery of unparalleled sophistication, a forgery that employed techniques unknown to medieval science, unknown to modern science, and unreproducible by either. If it is genuine, it is the most significant archaeological artifact in the history of the world, tangible, physical evidence of the central event of the Christian faith. Let us now examine the forensic evidence in greater detail, because the medical and forensic analysis of the Shroud is one of the most compelling aspects of the entire investigation. The study of the Shroud's wounds has involved some of the world's leading forensic pathologists. One of the most important figures in this research was Pierre Barbet, a French surgeon who published his findings in the 1950s in a landmark book called A Doctor at Calvary. Barbet conducted experiments on cadavers and amputated limbs to test whether the wound patterns on the Shroud were consistent with actual crucifixion. Barbet's most significant finding concerned the nail wounds in the wrists. As we mentioned earlier, virtually all medieval and Renaissance art depicts the nails of the crucifixion being driven through the palms of the hands. This tradition is so deeply embedded in Christian iconography that it has become the default image of the crucifixion in popular culture. But Barbet demonstrated through his experiments that a nail driven through the palm cannot support the weight of a hanging body. The nail would tear through the soft tissue between the metacarpal bones, and the body would fall. The only location in the hand area where a nail can support the weight of a body is the space known as distot space, a gap between the small carpal bones of the wrist. When Barbet drove a nail through distot space in a cadaver's wrist, he made a remarkable observation. The nail struck the median nerve, and the thumb of the cadaver reflexively retracted, pulled inward and downward against the palm. This is significant because the image on the shroud shows a man with no visible thumbs. The hands are crossed, and only 4 fingers are visible on each hand. The thumbs appear to be hidden beneath the palms, exactly what Barbet's experiments predicted would happen when a nail damages the median nerve. This is a detail that no medieval artist would have known. The anatomy of the wrist, the existence of distot space, and the reflex retraction of the thumb when the median nerve is damaged were not understood until the modern era. Yet the shroud depicts this anatomical response with perfect accuracy. Barbet's work was later extended and refined by other researchers. Frederick Zeughaib, a forensic pathologist and medical examiner, spent decades studying the biomechanics of crucifixion. Zeughaib's experiments involved suspending volunteers on a cross, with their weight supported by straps rather than nails, of course, and monitoring their vital signs to understand how crucifixion killed. Zeughaib concluded that the primary cause of death in crucifixion was not asphyxiation, as had previously been proposed, but rather traumatic shock, a cascade of physiological failures brought on by pain, blood loss, dehydration, and cardiovascular stress. His findings were consistent with the wound patterns on the shroud and with the gospel accounts of the crucifixion. Robert Buckland, a forensic pathologist and medical examiner, conducted what he called an autopsy of the shroud, a systematic examination of all the wounds visible on the cloth, interpreted as if he were examining an actual body. His conclusions were striking. He identified over 120 scourge marks on the back, consistent with 2 separate scourgers standing on either side of the victim and delivering blows with a multi-thonged whip. He identified puncture wounds encircling the entire scalp, consistent with a cap of thorns. He identified a large wound in the left side of the chest, between the 5th and 6th ribs, consistent with a spear thrust from right to left, entering the chest cavity and puncturing the pleural lining and the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart. Buckland's conclusion was that the shroud image depicts a real human body, a body that suffered a death entirely consistent with Roman crucifixion as described in the Gospels and confirmed by archaeological and historical evidence. He found no evidence whatsoever that the wounds were painted, fabricated, or artificially applied. The Pollen evidence is another fascinating dimension of the shroud investigation. In 1973 and again in 1978, Max Frey, a Swiss criminologist and botanist, was given permission to take sticky tape samples from the surface of the shroud. Using these tape samples, Frey identified pollen grains from dozens of different plant species. Remarkably, many of these species were not native to Europe. They were native to the Middle East, specifically to the regions of Palestine, Turkey, and the area around Constantinople. Frey identified pollen from plants that grow exclusively in the area around Jerusalem. He identified pollen from plants native to the region of Edessa. He identified pollen from plants found in and around Constantinople, and he identified pollen from plants common in France and Italy. This pollen distribution is exactly what we would expect if the shroud had traveled from Jerusalem to Edessa, from Edessa to Constantinople, from Constantinople to France, and from France to Italy, the very route that the Edessa-Constantinople theory proposes. Critics have challenged Frey's findings, arguing that his methodology was flawed and that some of the pollen may have been introduced through contamination. Frey died in 1983 before he could fully publish his results, and his collection of tape samples was inherited by other researchers who have continued to study them. Some of his identifications have been confirmed by subsequent analysis, while others remain disputed. but the general pattern, pollen from Palestine, Turkey, Constantinople, France, and Italy, has been broadly supported by later work. In the year 2000, Israeli botanists Avinoam Danon and Yuri Baruch conducted their own analysis of plant images and pollen on the shroud. Danon claimed to identify faint images of flowers and plants on the cloth images that could only be seen under specific lighting conditions. He identified several species, including Chrysanthemum coronarium and Zygophyllum dumasum, that bloom in the spring in the area around Jerusalem and are found nowhere else in the world in combination. Danon concluded that the flowers had been placed on the body at the time of burial and had left faint images on the cloth, and that the pollen evidence was consistent with the shroud having been in the Jerusalem area in the spring, the season of Passover, when the crucifixion is believed to have occurred. These botanical findings are suggestive but not conclusive. The identification of faint plant images on the shroud is subjective. Different researchers looking at the same areas of the cloth have come to different conclusions about what they see. But the pollen evidence, while disputed in its details, does point toward a Middle Eastern origin for the cloth, an origin that is inconsistent with a purely medieval European creation. Let us also consider the textile evidence, because the fabric itself has a story to tell. The shroud is made of linen cloth woven from the fibers of the flax plant. The weave pattern is a 3-to-1 herringbone twill, which means that each horizontal thread passes over 3 vertical threads and under one, with the pattern reversed at regular intervals to create a zigzag or herringbone effect. This is a relatively complex weave that requires a sophisticated loom. Textile experts have debated whether this weave pattern is consistent with a 1st century or a medieval origin. 3-to-1 herringbone twill has been found in textiles dating to the Roman period, and similar weave patterns have been identified in fabrics from archaeological sites in the Middle East. However, the weave was also known and used in medieval Europe. The weave pattern alone cannot definitively date the shroud, but other aspects of the textile are more revealing. The shroud is made entirely of linen, with no wool fibers mixed in. This is consistent with Jewish burial practices, which followed the Torah's prohibition against mixing linen and wool in the same garment. A Jewish burial shroud would be made of pure linen, and the shroud is pure linen. The thread used to sew the shroud has been identified as having been spun by hand, using a technique known as Z-twist, in which the fibers are twisted in a clockwise direction. This technique was common in the Middle East in the ancient world. In medieval Europe, the opposite technique, S-twist, or counterclockwise spinning, was more common. The presence of Z-twist spinning in the shroud is consistent with a Middle Eastern origin. The cotton fibers that Raymond Rogers found in the carbon dating sample area, cotton that was not present in the main body of the cloth, were identified as Gossypium herbaceum, a species of cotton native to the Middle East. While this cotton was found only in the repaired corner area, its presence is interesting because it suggests that the cloth was at some point in the Middle East, where it could have picked up stray cotton fibers during handling or storage. Traces of a starch coating have been found on the shroud fibers, a coating that is consistent with an ancient technique used in the Middle East to improve the handling properties of newly woven linen. This starch coating is not consistent with medieval European textile production methods. Taken together, the textile evidence points toward a Middle Eastern origin for the shroud, though it does not definitively prove one. Like the pollen evidence, it is suggestive rather than conclusive, but it is one more piece of a puzzle that, when assembled, paints a picture that is very difficult to reconcile with the simple hypothesis of a medieval European forgery. Now we must address the most fundamental question of all: how was the image formed? This is the question that has defeated every scientist who has ever studied the shroud, because despite decades of research, no one has been able to explain how the image got onto the cloth. Let us review what we know about the image. It is superficial, affecting only the outermost fibers. It is not painted, dyed, or printed. It has no directionality or brush strokes. It is a photographic negative. It contains three-dimensional information. It was formed after the blood was already on the cloth. It has no fluorescence under ultraviolet light, unlike any known paint or applied substance. Over the years, dozens of hypotheses have been proposed to explain the image. Let us consider the most significant ones. The contact hypothesis proposes that the image was formed by direct contact between the cloth and a body coated with some substance, perhaps spices, oils, or other funerary materials. When the cloth touched the body, the substance transferred to the cloth and created the image. This hypothesis can explain some features of the image but fails to explain others. A contact image would be distorted, stretched, and warped because a flat cloth pressed against a three-dimensional face produces a wider than normal image when the cloth is laid flat again. Try pressing a cloth over your face, marking the points of contact, and then removing the cloth and laying it flat. The resulting image will be grotesquely distorted. The shroud image is not distorted. It shows a normal, proportionally correct face and body. Furthermore, a contact image cannot explain the image in areas where the cloth was not in direct contact with the body, yet the shroud image is continuous across these areas. The vapor hypothesis proposes that chemical vapors rising from the body created the image. Ammonia and other gases released from a decomposing body could, in theory, react with spices or other substances on the cloth to produce a discoloration. This hypothesis was popular in the early 20th century but has been largely discredited. Vapor diffusion is a random, isotropic process. Gases spread outward in all directions equally. A vapor-generated image would be blurry, diffuse, and lacking in detail. The shroud image, by contrast, is remarkably detailed and sharp-edged. Furthermore, the vapor hypothesis cannot explain the three-dimensional information encoded in the image. The radiation hypothesis proposes that the image was formed by a burst of radiant energy, perhaps ultraviolet light, X-rays, or some other form of electromagnetic radiation emanating from the body. This hypothesis can explain many of the image's properties. A burst of radiation would be unidirectional, radiating outward from the body's surface. It would affect only the outermost fibers of the cloth. It would encode distance information, since the intensity of radiation decreases with distance from the source. It would create a negative image, since the areas closest to the body would receive the most radiation and therefore show the greatest discoloration. And it would not penetrate through the cloth if the energy were of the right type and intensity. In 2011, a team of scientists at the Enrie laboratory in Italy conducted experiments using an excimer laser, an ultraviolet laser that produces extremely short, intense pulses of light. They were able to produce a discoloration on linen that matched some of the properties of the shroud image, superficial, affecting only the outermost fibers, with no fluorescence. However, they were only able to produce this effect on a small area of cloth, and they noted that the total amount of ultraviolet energy required to produce the effect over the entire surface of the shroud would be enormous, far beyond any natural or artificial source available in the medieval period, and indeed beyond any single source available today. The ENEA team concluded that the origin of the image is still unknown, and that it is not possible to produce the shroud image using current technology. They did not claim that the image was miraculous, but they did note that the energy required to produce it was extraordinary. This finding is remarkable. Modern science, with all its technology, all its knowledge, all its resources, cannot explain how this image was formed. And yet, if the carbon dating is correct, someone in the medieval period, with far less technology, far less knowledge, and far fewer resources, supposedly created it. This is the paradox at the heart of the Shroud of Turin. The carbon dating says medieval. The science of the image says something else entirely. And this paradox has driven the debate for over 3 decades with no resolution in sight. As the first part of our story draws to a close, let us pause and take stock of where we stand. We have a piece of linen cloth that bears the image of a crucified man. The image has properties that are scientifically inexplicable. The blood on the cloth is real. The wound patterns are consistent with Roman crucifixion and with the Gospel accounts. The forensic evidence suggests a real human body. The textile and pollen evidence point toward a Middle Eastern origin. And yet the carbon dating places the cloth in the medieval period. We have a documented history that begins in France in 1354, with a cloth that appeared seemingly out of nowhere, its origin unexplained, its provenance unknown. We have an angry bishop who called it a fake and a pope who allowed it to be displayed but refused to call it authentic. We have theories connecting it to the Knights Templar, to the Byzantine Empire, to the ancient city of Edessa, and ultimately to the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth, theories that are plausible but unproven. We have a carbon dating result that has been challenged on multiple grounds: the representativeness of the sample, the possibility of contamination, the potential effects of the 1532 fire, and the hypothetical impact of radiation on carbon-14 levels. These challenges are serious and have been raised by credible scientists, but they remain disputed. And we have a mystery, the deepest mystery of all, which is the image itself. No one knows how it got there. No one can replicate it. No one can explain it. In the second part of our story, we will follow the shroud from its early years in France through the centuries, through the hands of dukes and kings, through fires and wars, through the age of photography and the space age, through the carbon dating controversy and beyond. We will examine the latest research, the newest theories, and the ongoing battle between faith and skepticism. We will meet the scientists who have devoted their lives to studying this cloth and the critics who have devoted their lives to debunking it. And we will confront the ultimate question, the question that has haunted humanity for 2,000 years. Is this cloth what it claims to be? Did it once wrap the body of Jesus Christ? And if it did, what does the image tell us about what happened in that tomb on the first Easter morning? The answers, if there are answers, await us in part 2. But before we get there, consider this. Whether the Shroud of Turin is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus or the most sophisticated forgery in human history, one thing is certain. It is an object that forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge, the boundaries of our science, and the deepest questions of our existence. It is an object that refuses to be dismissed, refuses to be explained, and refuses to be forgotten. 14 feet of linen, an image of a man, and a mystery that may never be solved. The story of the Shroud of Turin is not just a story about a relic. It is a story about us, about what we believe, what we doubt, what we know, and what we can never know. It is a story about the intersection of faith and reason, of history and legend, of science and mystery, and it is a story that is far, far from over. Let us now return to the medieval world and explore more deeply the cultural and religious environment in which the shroud first appeared, because understanding this environment is essential to evaluating the claims made both for and against the cloth's authenticity. The 14th century was, by almost any measure, one of the most catastrophic periods in European history. The Black Death, the bubonic plague, arrived in Europe in 1347 and swept across the continent with terrifying speed. In the space of just a few years, it killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, between a third and half of Europe's entire population. Entire villages were wiped out, cities were depopulated. The social, economic, and psychological fabric of European civilization was torn apart. The impact of the plague on religious life was profound. On one hand, the plague intensified religious devotion. People turned to God with desperate fervor, praying for deliverance, making pilgrimages, purchasing indulgences, and venerating relics with an intensity that bordered on frenzy. The demand for relics, tangible, physical connections to the divine, skyrocketed. If God seemed distant, if prayers seemed unanswered, if the clergy were dying alongside the laity, then perhaps a relic, a piece of the true cross, a bone of a saint, the burial cloth of Christ, could provide the divine intercession that nothing else could. On the other hand, the plague also bred skepticism and disillusionment. The Church had failed to prevent the plague, failed to explain it, and failed to stop it. Clergy died at the same rate as everyone else, proving that holiness was no protection against the disease. Some began to question the Church's authority, its teachings, and the validity of its claims. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation, which would not flower for another century and a half, were planted in the plague-scorched soil of the 14th century. It was in this environment, this volatile mixture of desperate faith and growing doubt, that the Shroud of Turin made its first public appearance. And the timing is significant. The shroud emerged at precisely the moment when the demand for powerful relics was at its highest, and when the supply of fraudulent relics was also at its highest. This does not prove that the shroud is a fake, but it does place its appearance in a context that is consistent with fabrication. A forger seeking to profit from the relic trade, or a nobleman seeking to enhance the prestige of his private chapel, would have had every reason to produce a spectacular relic in the years following the Black Death. But once again, we are left with the same stubborn problem. If the shroud is a forgery, how was the image created? No medieval forger, no matter how skilled, no matter how motivated, had access to technology capable of producing an image with the properties we have described. And so the debate continues. Let us consider in more detail the argument that the shroud is a medieval painting. This is the simplest explanation and the one most frequently offered by skeptics. It is also the explanation that has the most difficulty accounting for the evidence. If the shroud image is a painting, then it was painted by an artist of extraordinary genius, an artist who anticipated the invention of photography by at least 400 years, who understood anatomy better than any medieval physician, who knew details of Roman crucifixion that were lost to medieval scholarship, who painted in a perfect photographic negative that would only become visible when the technology to reverse it was invented centuries later, who encoded three-dimensional distance information in a two-dimensional image, who used real human blood as part of his palette and applied it before creating the image, and who did all of this using a technique that leaves no brush strokes, no pigment, no directional marks, and affects only the outermost 200 nanometers of the linen fibers. This is not impossible, but it is, to put it mildly, extremely implausible. Several specific claims of painting have been made over the years, and each has been tested and found wanting. In 1978, a team of scientists known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP, conducted the most extensive scientific examination of the shroud ever performed. The team included physicists, chemists, photographers, and other specialists from some of the world's most prestigious research institutions. Over the course of 5 days, they subjected the shroud to dozens of tests, including ultraviolet fluorescence photography, X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, infrared reflectography, and direct microscopic examination. One of the key findings of the STURP team was that the image is not the result of any applied substance. Walter Macron, a microscopist who was part of the STURP team, disagreed with this finding. Macron claimed to have found iron oxide particles, the basic ingredient of red ochre paint, on the shroud fibers, and he concluded that the image was painted using a dilute wash of iron oxide pigment in a collagen gelatin binder. Macron's findings were disputed by other members of the STURP team. They pointed out that iron oxide is a common contaminant found on virtually all ancient textiles. It comes from dust, from water, from contact with iron objects, and from the decomposition of blood hemoglobin. The presence of iron oxide on the shroud does not prove that the image was painted any more than the presence of dust on a window proves that someone drew on it with a dusty finger. Furthermore, the STURP team's chemical analysis showed that the iron oxide on the shroud was not bound in a collagen medium, as Macron claimed. The particles were randomly distributed and did not correspond to the image areas. They were found in both image and non-image areas in roughly equal concentrations. And the spectroscopic analysis showed that the discoloration that forms the image is the result of a chemical change in the cellulose of the linen itself, a dehydration and oxidation of the fibers, rather than the application of any external substance. Macron published his findings and maintained his position until his death, but his conclusions were rejected by the majority of the STURP team and by subsequent researchers. The consensus of the scientific community that has studied the shroud directly, as opposed to commenting on it from a distance, is that the image is not painted. In 2009, an Italian scientist named Luigi Garlaschelli announced that he had successfully reproduced the shroud using medieval techniques. Garlaschelli's method involved draping a linen cloth over a volunteer, rubbing it with an acidic pigment containing iron oxide, and then aging the cloth by heating it in an oven. He claimed that the result was a reasonable facsimile of the shroud. Garlaschelli's reproduction received widespread media coverage, and many skeptics cited it as proof that the shroud could have been made by a medieval forger. But when his reproduction was examined closely, it fell far short of matching the properties of the original. Garlaschelli's image was created by rubbing. It showed clear directionality and brushstroke-like marks. The shroud image has no directionality. Garlaschelli's image did not encode three-dimensional distance information. When processed by a VP8 image analyzer, it produced a distorted, incoherent relief, nothing like the perfect three-dimensional form produced by the shroud. Garlaschelli's image was formed by an applied substance, pigment, that could be detected on the surface of the cloth. The shroud image has no applied substance. Garlaschelli's image did not have the superficial character of the shroud image. It penetrated deeper into the fibers and showed evidence of capillary flow. In short, Garlaschelli produced a vaguely shroud-like image on a piece of cloth, but his reproduction did not match the shroud in any of its most important characteristics. It demonstrated that you can put a human-shaped stain on a piece of linen using medieval materials, which no one ever doubted, but it did not demonstrate that you can create the shroud image using medieval materials. The difference is significant. Other attempts at reproduction have met with similar results. Artists, scientists, and technicians have tried painting, scorching, acid etching, photographic transfer, and dozens of other techniques. Some have produced results that superficially resemble the shroud, but none have matched all of its properties simultaneously. The shroud image remains, as the ENEA laboratory concluded, unreproducible using current technology. As we approach the end of Part 1, let us consider one more dimension of this story, the dimension of faith. For millions of Christians around the world, the Shroud of Turin is more than a scientific puzzle or a historical curiosity. It is a sacred object, a tangible connection to the most important event in their faith, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. When they look at the face on the shroud, they see the face of their Lord and Savior. When they contemplate the wounds, they meditate on his suffering. When they consider the mystery of the image, they see evidence of the resurrection, the moment when, according to Christian belief, the dead body of Jesus was transformed, glorified, and raised to new life. This dimension of the shroud story cannot be dismissed or ignored, because it is this dimension that gives the story its power and its significance. The shroud matters. It matters to millions of people, not because of what scientists can measure on its surface, but because of what it represents. It represents the possibility that the central claim of Christianity, that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, is not merely a matter of faith, but a matter of fact. It represents the possibility that there is physical, tangible, scientific evidence for the most miraculous event in human history. And this is what makes the shroud debate so passionate, so contentious, and so unresolvable, because the stakes are not merely scientific, they are existential, they are spiritual. They touch the deepest questions of human existence. Is there a God? Does life continue after death? Did Jesus rise from the dead? And if he did, what does that mean for us? The Shroud of Turin does not answer these questions. No artifact can, but it keeps them alive. It forces us to confront them. It refuses to let us settle into comfortable certainty, either the comfortable certainty of faith or the comfortable certainty of skepticism. It sits at the intersection of the known and the unknown, the provable and the unprovable, the natural and the supernatural, and it challenges us to grapple with the mystery. This is why the Shroud of Turin is the most important relic in the history of the world, not because we know what it is, but because we do not. not because it provides answers, but because it asks questions that we cannot avoid, cannot dismiss, and cannot fully answer. The year is 1354. A piece of linen cloth is displayed in a small church in Lirey, France. A crucified man stares out from the fabric, or rather, his negative image stares out, waiting centuries for the invention of photography to reveal his face. His wounds tell the story of the most famous death in history. His image defies scientific explanation. His identity, if he has one, is the most consequential claim ever made about a piece of cloth. Is it real? Is it a forgery? Is it something we do not yet have the categories to understand? The story continues in part 2. The shroud's journey through history is far from over. It will pass through the hands of dukes and duchesses, survive fires and wars, be photographed and televised, be probed by lasers and analyzed by computers. It will inspire devotion and provoke fury. It will be called the greatest relic in Christendom and the most elaborate hoax in history. And through it all it will keep its secret, 14 feet of ancient linen, an image that should not exist, a mystery that will not die. Welcome back. If you are just joining us, we have been telling the story of the most mysterious, most studied, most debated artifact in human history, the Shroud of Turin. In part 1, we explored the origins of the shroud, the extraordinary properties of the image it bears, the forensic evidence of crucifixion wounds that match the gospel accounts with eerie precision, the first public display of the cloth in France in 1354, and the explosive carbon dating results of 1988 that place the cloth in the medieval period, results that have been challenged on multiple scientific grounds. Now, in part 2, we pick up the story where we left off. We will follow the shroud through centuries of history, through the hands of one of Europe's most powerful noble families, through devastating fires, through wars and revolutions, through the age of photography, through the most ambitious scientific examination ever conducted on a single artifact, and into the modern era where the debate rages on with no sign of resolution. We will examine the latest scientific research, the newest theories, and the deepest philosophical questions raised by this extraordinary piece of cloth. And we will confront the ultimate question, the question that the shroud has been asking humanity for 700 years and possibly for 2,000. Let us begin. When we left the shroud at the end of part 1, it was in the possession of the family of Geoffroi de Charny, displayed in the small collegiate church at Lirey, France, under a papal ruling that allowed it to be shown but required it to be described as a representation rather than as the authentic burial cloth of Christ. Geoffroi de Charny died at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, and the shroud passed to his son, Geoffroi II. The younger Geoffroi continued to display the cloth at Lirey, and it was during his tenure that Bishop Pierre d'Arcis wrote his famous letter to Pope Clement VII, denouncing the shroud as a fake. After the papal compromise, the shroud remained at Lirey, but it was displayed only intermittently, and its fame waxed and waned. Geoffroi II died in 1398, and the shroud passed to his daughter, Marguerite de Charny. And it is with Marguerite that the story takes a dramatic turn, because Marguerite did something that would alter the trajectory of the shroud's history forever. She gave it away. In 1453, Marguerite de Charny transferred the shroud to the House of Savoy, specifically to Duke Louis I of Savoy and his wife, Anne de Lusignan. The circumstances of this transfer are murky. The canons of Lirey protested vigorously, claiming that the shroud was the property of their church and that Marguerite had no right to give it away. Legal battles ensued. Marguerite was eventually excommunicated, though whether this was for the transfer of the shroud or for other reasons is debated by historians. She died in 1460, and the shroud remained with the Savoy family. The House of Savoy was one of the oldest and most powerful noble families in Europe. They ruled the Duchy of Savoy, which straddled the Alps between what is now France and Italy, and they would eventually become the royal family of a unified Italy in the 19th century. The Savoys recognized the shroud for what it was, an object of extraordinary prestige and spiritual significance, and they treated it accordingly. Under the Savoys, the shroud was elevated from a contested relic in a rural French church to the centerpiece of one of Europe's most powerful dynastic collections. The Savoys built a special chapel to house it. They commissioned elaborate reliquaries to protect it. They displayed it on major feast days and at important political events, and they used it, quite deliberately, to enhance their own authority and legitimacy. Possession of the burial cloth of Christ was a powerful statement. It placed the Savoy family in a unique position among the Christian rulers of Europe. In 1502, Duke Philibert II of Savoy built the Sainte-Chapelle in Chambéry, the ducal capital, specifically to house the shroud. This was a magnificent chapel, richly decorated and designed to serve as a worthy home for the most sacred relic in the Savoy collection. The shroud was kept in a silver reliquary behind the altar, displayed to the faithful on special occasions. And it was in this chapel, 30 years later, that the shroud nearly perished. The fire of December 4, 1532, is one of the most traumatic events in the shroud's history. A fire broke out in the sacristy of the Sainte-Chapelle, and it spread rapidly through the building. The heat was intense. The silver reliquary in which the shroud was stored was heated to an extreme temperature, and molten silver dripped through the container onto the folded cloth inside. 2 Franciscan friars and a local blacksmith broke into the chapel and managed to rescue the reliquary before it was completely consumed. But the damage was already done. The molten silver had burned through multiple layers of the folded cloth, creating a series of symmetrical burn holes along both sides of the image. Water, used either to extinguish the fire or seeping into the reliquary from firefighting efforts, had soaked the cloth, leaving large water stains. The shroud survived, but it was scarred. The burn marks and water stains are clearly visible today, running in parallel lines along the length of the cloth, flanking the central image. They are a constant reminder of how close the world came to losing this extraordinary artifact. In 1534, the Poor Clare nuns of Chambéry undertook the task of repairing the fire damage. They sewed patches of Holland cloth over the worst burn holes and attached a full-length backing cloth, known as the Holland backing cloth, to support the weakened fabric. These repairs would remain in place for over 460 years, until they were removed during a major conservation effort in 2002. The fire of 1532 is significant not only because of the physical damage it inflicted, but also because of its potential impact on the scientific evidence. As we discussed in Part 1, some researchers have argued that the extreme heat of the fire could have altered the carbon-14 content of the cloth, potentially skewing the radiocarbon dating results. Others have pointed out that the water used to fight the fire could have deposited contaminants on the cloth. These arguments remain unresolved, but they illustrate how a single historical event, a fire in a chapel nearly 500 years ago, can have profound implications for modern scientific analysis. After the fire, the shroud continued its journey with the House of Savoy. In 1578, the Savoys moved their capital from Chambéry to Turin, the city that would give the shroud its modern name. The ostensible reason for moving the shroud to Turin was to shorten the journey for Carlo Borromeo, the saintly Archbishop of Milan, who had vowed to make a pilgrimage on foot to venerate the cloth. Rather than requiring the aging archbishop to cross the Alps to Chambéry, the Savoys brought the shroud across to Turin. But the move was also political. Turin was the new center of Savoy power, and having the shroud there enhanced the city's prestige and reinforced the duke's authority. The shroud became the symbol of Turin, the spiritual heart of the Savoy domain, and it has remained in Turin ever since. In 1694, the shroud was placed in a specially built chapel, the Chapel of the Holy Shroud, designed by the brilliant architect Guarino Guarini, attached to the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin. Guarini's chapel is a masterpiece of Baroque architecture, with a soaring dome constructed of interlocking arches that create an effect of dizzying, spiraling ascent. The chapel was specifically designed to house the shroud, and it served as the cloth's home for over 300 years. Throughout this period, the shroud was displayed publicly only on rare occasions, typically at major events such as royal weddings, coronations, and jubilee years. Each display attracted enormous crowds. Pilgrims came from across Europe to see the cloth, and the displays were accompanied by elaborate ceremonies, processions, and devotional services. But the shroud was not merely an object of religious veneration. It was also a subject of growing intellectual curiosity. Scholars, artists, and scientists began to study the cloth, and their observations would lay the groundwork for the scientific investigations of the 20th century. The first truly scientific study of the shroud began, as we mentioned in Part 1, in 1898, when the Italian lawyer and amateur photographer Secondo was given permission to photograph the cloth during a public display. We have already described Paya's extraordinary discovery, the revelation that the shroud image is a photographic negative. But let us linger on this moment a little longer, because it was a turning point in the history of the shroud and in the relationship between science and faith. When Paya developed his glass plate negatives and saw, for the first time, the positive image of the man on the shroud, he was overwhelmed. The face that emerged from the photographic reversal was startlingly lifelike, a portrait of a man in death, serene and dignified despite the marks of terrible suffering. Paya reportedly wept. He felt that he was looking at the face of Christ, but not everyone shared his reaction. Skeptics immediately accused Paya of fraud, of manipulating his photographs to create a sensational result. They argued that his equipment was faulty, his technique was flawed, and his results were an artifact of the photographic process rather than a genuine property of the cloth. These accusations were laid to rest in 1931, when a professional photographer named Giuseppe Enrie was commissioned to take a new set of photographs during another public display. Enrie used better equipment, more rigorous technique, and careful controls. His results confirmed Paya's findings completely. The shroud image was indeed a photographic negative. The accusation of fraud was withdrawn, and the scientific world was forced to grapple with a new and deeply puzzling question. How could a photographic negative exist on a piece of cloth that predated the invention of photography by centuries? Enrie's photographs also revealed details of the shroud image that had not been visible to the naked eye. The scourge marks on the back became clearer. The wound patterns on the scalp, wrists, and feet became more defined. The blood stain at the side, with its separation of blood and clear fluid, was strikingly visible. The photographs transformed the shroud from a faint, enigmatic image into a detailed record of a crucified man, a record that could now be studied, measured, and analyzed. The mid-20th century saw a growing interest in the shroud among scientists, physicians, and researchers. Pierre Barbet, the French surgeon whose work on the wrist wounds we described in Part 1, published his findings and sparked a new wave of medical investigation. Other physicians and forensic pathologists followed, each contributing to a growing body of evidence that the wounds depicted on the shroud were consistent with real trauma, specifically with the trauma of Roman crucifixion. But it was in the 1970s that the scientific investigation of the shroud reached a new level of intensity and rigor. In 1973, a commission appointed by Cardinal Pellegrino, the Archbishop of Turin, was given access to the shroud for a limited examination. This commission included textile experts, forensic specialists, and the Swiss criminologist Max Frey, whose Pollen studies we discussed in Part 1. The commission's findings were preliminary but suggestive, and they fueled growing demand for a more comprehensive scientific examination. That demand was answered in 1978 when the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP, was given unprecedented access to the cloth for a 5-day intensive study. The STURP team was composed of approximately 40 scientists and technicians, drawn from institutions including the Los Alamos National Laboratory, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the Air Force Academy, and several major universities and research centers. They brought with them over 8 tons of equipment, cameras, spectrometers, microscopes, X-ray machines, and other instruments, and they worked around the clock for 5 days, subjecting the shroud to the most thorough scientific examination any artifact had ever received. The STURP team's findings, published over the following years in a series of peer-reviewed papers, were groundbreaking. Let us review the most significant conclusions. First, the image is not a painting. The team found no evidence of pigment, dye, ink, or any other applied coloring substance in the image areas. The discoloration that forms the image is a chemical change in the cellulose of the linen fibers themselves, a dehydration and oxidation that is chemically similar to the yellowing that occurs naturally in aged linen, but accelerated and concentrated in a pattern that forms the image. Second, the blood is real. Chemical tests confirmed the presence of hemoglobin, albumin, and other blood components. The blood was identified as human blood, type AB. The blood was on the cloth before the image was formed. Wherever there is blood, there is no underlying image. Third, the image has no directionality. There are no brush strokes, no application marks, no evidence of any tool or instrument being used to create the image. This rules out not only painting, but also any technique involving the physical application of a substance to the cloth. Fourth, the image is superficial. It affects only the outermost 2 or 3 fibers of each thread, and within each fiber only the outermost layer, a layer estimated at 200 nanometers thick. The image does not penetrate into the bulk of the cloth. Fifth, the image contains 3-dimensional information. The VP8 image analyzer results, which we described in Part 1, were confirmed and extended by the STURP team. The image encodes a mathematically precise relationship between image intensity and cloth-to-body distance. The STURP team's final summary statement, published in 1981, reads, "We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist." The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or perhaps by some future group of scientists, the problem remains unsolved. This conclusion from a team of scientists who had spent 5 days examining the cloth with every tool at their disposal is perhaps the most important single statement in the history of shroud research. The image is not a painting, the blood is real. The image remains unexplained, the problem is unsolved, and then came the carbon dating. We discussed the carbon dating results in Part 1, but let us now examine the events surrounding the dating in more detail, because the process was mired in controversy from the very beginning. The idea of carbon dating the shroud had been discussed since the 1960s, but the technology available at that time required a sample so large that it would have caused unacceptable damage to the cloth. By the 1980s, however, a new technique, accelerator mass spectrometry, or AMS, had been developed that could date a sample as small as a postage stamp. This made carbon dating of the shroud feasible for the first time. In 1984, a detailed protocol for the dating was drawn up. The original plan called for 7 laboratories to participate, using 2 different dating methods, with samples taken from multiple locations on the cloth. This protocol was designed to maximize the reliability of the results and to minimize the risk of sampling error. It was a rigorous, carefully thought-out plan, but the protocol was not followed. By the time the dating was actually carried out in 1988, the plan had been significantly scaled back. Only 3 laboratories participated instead of 7. Only 1 dating method was used, AMS, instead of 2. And crucially, the sample was taken from only 1 location on the cloth, the lower left corner. The reasons for these changes are disputed. Some blame the Vatican, which controlled access to the shroud. Others blame the laboratories, which disagreed among themselves about the protocol. Others point to personal rivalries and institutional politics within the scientific community. Whatever the reasons, the result was a dating process that was far less rigorous than the original protocol intended. The sample was cut from the shroud on April 21, 1988, in a ceremony at the Cathedral of Turin. Cardinal Anastasio Balestrero, the Archbishop of Turin, supervised the cutting. A single strip of cloth, approximately 7 centimeters by 1 centimeter, was cut from the corner of the shroud. This strip was divided into portions, and each portion was sealed and distributed to the 3 participating laboratories. Over the following months, each laboratory conducted its tests. On October 13, 1988, the results were announced at a press conference at the British Museum in London. The 3 laboratories agreed. The shroud dated to between 1260 and 1390 AD with 95% confidence. The announcement was a bombshell. Headlines around the world declared the shroud a medieval fake. Many newspapers and television reports treated the carbon dating as the final word, the definitive scientific verdict that ended the debate once and for all. But the debate did not end. In fact, it intensified. Almost immediately, questions were raised about the validity of the results. We discussed some of these challenges in Part 1, the concerns about the sample location, Raymond Rogers's evidence of medieval reweaving in the sample area, the potential effects of contamination, and the 1532 fire. But there are additional concerns that deserve attention. One significant issue is the statistical analysis of the carbon dating results. While the 3 laboratories agreed on a general medieval date range, there was a notable spread in their individual results. The University of Arizona dated the sample to approximately 1304 AD. The University of Oxford dated it to approximately 1200 AD. The Swiss Federal Institute of Technology dated it to approximately 1274 AD. When these results were combined using standard statistical methods, the resulting range was 1260 to 1390 AD. However, several statisticians have pointed out that the spread between the 3 laboratories' results is larger than would be expected if all 3 were measuring the same homogeneous material. In statistical terms, the chi-squared value for the combined results was higher than acceptable limits, suggesting that the 3 laboratories may not have been measuring the same thing. This could be explained by contamination, by non-homogeneity in the sample, or by other factors, but it raises the possibility that the combined date range is not as reliable as the Nature paper suggested. In 2019, a paper published in the journal Archaeometry by French researcher Tristan Casabianca and his colleagues reanalyzed the raw data from the 1988 dating. They had obtained the original measurement data from the 3 laboratories through a Freedom of Information request, data that had not been published in the original Nature paper. Their analysis confirmed that the data showed significant heterogeneity, that the measurements from different laboratories, and even from different portions of the same laboratory's sample, showed more variation than could be explained by random experimental error. Casabianca and his colleagues concluded that the 1988 result is not a concordant result, and that the samples may have been contaminated or may not have been representative of the bulk of the shroud. They called for new dating tests using samples from multiple locations on the cloth in accordance with the original 1984 protocol. This paper was significant because it challenged the carbon dating results using the laboratory's own data, and it was published in a peer-reviewed archaeological journal. It did not claim that the shroud was ancient. It claimed that the 1988 dating was flawed and that the question of the shroud's age remains open. The question of the shroud's age has also been addressed through methods other than radiocarbon dating, and some of these methods have produced results that conflict with the medieval date. One such method is the analysis of vanillin content. Vanillin is a chemical compound produced by the thermal decomposition of lignin, a component of plant fibers. Over time, vanillin slowly breaks down and disappears from linen cloth. By measuring the vanillin content of the shroud's fibers, Raymond Rogers estimated that the cloth was between 1,300 and 3,000 years old, consistent with a first-century origin and inconsistent with a medieval one. Rogers's vanillin analysis was published in the same 2005 Thermochimica Acta paper in which he presented his evidence for medieval reweaving in the carbon dating sample area. His findings have been both supported and challenged by subsequent researchers, but they represent an independent dating method that produces a very different result from the carbon dating. Another method that has been applied to the shroud is mechanical and optical testing of the fibers. Giulio Fanti, a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Padua in Italy, has developed techniques for dating ancient textiles based on the mechanical properties of the fibers, specifically their breaking strength and their response to stress. In 2013, Fanti published results suggesting that the shroud dates to approximately 33 BC, plus or minus 250 years, a range that includes the time of the Crucifixion. Fanti has also used infrared spectroscopy and Raman spectroscopy to analyze the chemical composition of the shroud fibers and compare them with fibers of known age. His results, again, suggest a date consistent with the 1st century rather than the medieval period. These alternative dating methods are not as well established as radiocarbon dating, and their results have been received with caution by the scientific community. But they represent a growing body of evidence that challenges the 1988 carbon dating and suggests that the true age of the shroud may be significantly older than the medieval period. Let us now turn to the conservation of the shroud and the remarkable discoveries that have been made during conservation efforts. In 2002, the shroud underwent a major conservation and restoration effort. For the first time since 1534, the patches sewn on by the Poor Clare nuns after the fire of 1532 were removed. The Holland backing cloth was also removed, exposing the reverse side of the shroud for the first time in nearly 5 centuries. This was a momentous event because the reverse side of the shroud had never been scientifically examined. When the backing cloth was removed, researchers discovered something remarkable. A faint image of the face was visible on the reverse side of the cloth. This reverse side face image had properties that were similar to the front side image. It was superficial, affecting only the outermost fibers on the back surface of the cloth. Between the front side image and the back side image, the interior fibers of the cloth were unaffected. The image existed only on the 2 outermost surfaces, with clean, uncolored fibers in between. This finding has profound implications for any theory of image formation. It means that whatever process created the image, it acted on both surfaces of the cloth simultaneously while leaving the interior fibers untouched. This is extremely difficult to explain by any conventional mechanism. A burst of radiation, for example, would typically penetrate the entire thickness of the cloth or be absorbed by the outermost layer without reaching the back. A chemical reaction would typically spread through the fibers by diffusion, affecting the interior as well as the surfaces. The double surface image with a clean interior is a property that adds yet another constraint to the already impossibly constrained list of characteristics that any explanation of the image must account for. The 2002 conservation also revealed details of the cloth's construction that had been hidden by the backing cloth. The stitching patterns, the selvage edges, and the overall structure of the fabric could now be studied in detail. Textile experts noted that the stitching used in the shroud's seam, a side strip that runs along one edge of the cloth, was identical to stitching found in textiles from the 1st century at the fortress of Masada in Israel. This is a highly specific and unusual stitching pattern that is not found in medieval European textiles. Now let us consider the shroud in the broader context of the history of Christianity and its impact on Christian art and culture. One of the most fascinating aspects of the shroud is the possibility that it influenced, indeed, that it defined, the way Jesus has been depicted in art for over 1,000 years. As we mentioned in Part 1, the conventional image of Jesus in art, the long-faced, bearded man with shoulder-length hair and a solemn, forward-looking gaze, did not always exist. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, Jesus was depicted in a variety of ways. In Roman catacomb paintings, he is sometimes shown as a young, beardless man, almost a boy, with short hair, resembling a Roman philosopher or shepherd. In other early depictions, he is shown with a beard but without the standardized features that we associate with the face of Jesus today. Sometime around the 6th century, a standardized image of Jesus began to emerge in Byzantine art, a long, narrow face with large eyes, a prominent nose, a forked beard, and long hair parted in the middle. This image became the template for virtually all subsequent depictions of Jesus in both Eastern and Western art. It is so deeply embedded in our visual culture that we cannot imagine Jesus looking any other way. Art historian Ian Wilson was one of the first to propose that this standardized image was based on the shroud, specifically on the Mandylion, which, if it was the shroud folded to show only the face, would have provided a portrait of Jesus that artists could copy. Wilson identified a set of distinctive features, which he called the Vignon markings, after the French researcher Paul Vignon, who first catalogued them, that appear both on the shroud face and in Byzantine depictions of Christ. These markings include a topless square between the eyebrows, a V shape at the bridge of the nose, raised eyebrows, enlarged left nostril, an accent line on one cheek, a hairless area between the lip and the beard, and several other distinctive features. Vignon and Wilson found that many Byzantine icons and mosaics of Christ display these same markings, sometimes all of them, sometimes a subset in a pattern that suggests they were copied from a single prototype. If this prototype was the shroud, then the shroud was not merely a relic, it was the original portrait of Jesus. It was the image from which all subsequent images derived. Every painting of Jesus, every mosaic, every icon, every stained glass window, every children's Bible illustration, all of them trace their lineage back to a single piece of linen cloth bearing an image that was not made by human hands. This is a remarkable claim, and it is not universally accepted, but the correspondence between the shroud face and the Byzantine Christ is striking, and the Vignon markings provide a specific, testable connection between the two. If the shroud influenced Byzantine art, then the cloth must have been in existence and accessible to artists well before the 14th century, which contradicts the carbon dating but supports the Mandylion Edessa theory. Let us also consider the Prey manuscript, or Prey Codex, a document that provides one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for a pre-medieval existence of the shroud. The Prey Codex is a Hungarian manuscript dating to approximately 1192 to 1195, at least 65 years before the earliest possible carbon dating date of 1260. The manuscript contains, among other things, an illustration that appears to depict the burial and resurrection of Christ, and this illustration contains details that are strikingly similar to the shroud. The illustration shows a naked body lying on a long cloth. The hands are crossed over the lower abdomen in exactly the same position as the hands on the shroud, the left hand over the right with the fingers extended. The figure has no thumbs visible, just as the shroud figure has no visible thumbs, and the cloth beneath and above the body shows a pattern of small circles, 4 holes arranged in an L-shaped pattern that corresponds to a set of burn marks on the shroud known as the poker holes. These poker holes are a set of small, symmetrical burn marks on the shroud that predate the fire of 1532. They appear to have been caused by a hot poker or similar object being pressed against the folded cloth, creating a pattern of 4 holes that repeats through the layers. The pattern is distinctive and unusual, and it appears, apparently, in the Prey Codex illustration. If the Prey Codex illustrator was depicting the shroud, and the correspondence between the illustration and the cloth is remarkably specific, then the shroud must have existed before 1195, which is before the carbon dating range of 1260 to 1390. This would mean either that the carbon dating is wrong or that the illustrator was depicting a different cloth that happened to share multiple specific and unusual features with the shroud. The Prey Codex evidence is widely cited by shroud supporters and has never been satisfactorily explained by skeptics. It remains one of the strongest arguments against the medieval dating of the cloth. The shroud has also been the subject of intense scrutiny by physicists, and their findings have added further dimensions to the mystery. In the early 2000s, a team led by Giulio Fanti at the University of Padua conducted a series of experiments using corona discharge, an electrical phenomenon in which a high-voltage field causes ionization of the air surrounding a conductive surface, producing ultraviolet radiation. Fanti proposed that the image on the shroud could have been produced by a corona discharge emanating from the body's surface, a phenomenon that, under certain conditions, could discolor the outermost fibers of a linen cloth in a way consistent with the shroud image. Corona discharge can be produced naturally under certain conditions, for example, during earthquakes, when piezoelectric effects in stressed rock generate high-voltage fields. Some researchers have proposed that a seismic event at the time of the Crucifixion, an event recorded in the Gospels which describe an earthquake at the moment of Jesus' death, could have generated a corona discharge that imprinted the image on the cloth. This theory is speculative, and it has not been widely accepted, but it illustrates the lengths to which scientists have gone in their efforts to explain the shroud image through natural mechanisms. Every proposed explanation, contact, vapor, radiation, corona discharge, Maillard reaction, protonic model, can account for some of the image's properties but fails to account for all of them. No single mechanism explains everything, and this failure, this inability of any proposed mechanism to fully account for the image, is itself one of the most remarkable aspects of the shroud. There is another physical phenomenon associated with the shroud that deserves mention, the evidence or alleged evidence of coins placed over the eyes. In 1977, a Jesuit priest and physicist named Francis Filas was examining high-resolution photographs of the shroud when he noticed what appeared to be small, circular objects over the eyes of the figure. Using computer image enhancement, Filas identified what he believed were impressions of coins, specifically a lepton of Pontius Pilate, a small bronze coin minted in Judea during Pilate's governorship from 26 to 36 AD. Filas claimed to have identified specific letters and design elements on the coin impressions, elements that matched known examples of Pilate's leptons. If correct, this would be extraordinary evidence for the authenticity of the shroud, because it would place the cloth in 1st century Palestine and connect it directly to the period of the Crucifixion. Other researchers, using different enhancement techniques, have also reported seeing coin-like impressions over the eyes. The practice of placing coins over the eyes of the dead was known in the ancient world. It was a common funerary practice in both Jewish and Greco-Roman culture. And archaeological evidence from 1st century tombs in Palestine has confirmed that coins were sometimes placed in the skulls of the deceased. However, the coin identification remains highly controversial. Critics argue that the alleged coin impressions are artifacts of the photographic process, patterns created by the grain of the photograph rather than actual features of the cloth. The images are extremely faint and ambiguous, and what one researcher sees as a letter or design element, another sees as random noise. The coin evidence is suggestive but far from conclusive, and it has never been independently verified to the satisfaction of the broader scientific community. Let us now examine the theological dimension of the shroud in greater depth, because the theological implications of this cloth are as profound as its scientific mysteries. For believing Christians, the Shroud of Turin is not just a burial cloth. It is potential evidence of the resurrection, and this is what sets it apart from every other relic in Christian history. Consider the logic. If the shroud is authentic, if it is the actual burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, then it was in direct contact with his body in the tomb. The blood on the cloth is his blood. The image on the cloth is his image. And the manner in which the image was formed may tell us something about what happened in that tomb. The body image shows no signs of decomposition. The blood clots on the cloth are intact and undisturbed. If a body had been physically removed from the cloth, pulled out of the shroud by hand, the blood clots would have been smeared, broken, and distorted, but they are not. They are perfectly preserved with sharp, well-defined edges. This means that the body was not physically removed from the cloth. It did not slide out, it was not pulled out, it was not unwrapped. The blood clots remained intact because the body, in some manner, ceased to be in contact with the cloth without any lateral movement. For believers, the explanation is obvious. The body dematerialized. It passed through the cloth. It was transformed, glorified in the act of resurrection. And in the instant of that transformation, a burst of energy, light, radiation, some force that we do not fully understand, imprinted the image on the cloth. This interpretation aligns with the Gospel accounts. The Gospels describe the disciples finding the empty tomb with the burial cloths lying undisturbed, not unwound, not thrown aside, but lying in place, as if the body had simply vanished from within them. The Gospel of John specifically notes that the face cloth, the Sudarium, was not lying with the linen cloths but rolled up in a place by itself. This careful description of the position of the burial cloths suggests that something unusual had happened, that the body had not been removed in the ordinary way. The shroud, if authentic, provides physical evidence for this account. The intact blood clots, the undisturbed image, the mysterious process of image formation, all of these are consistent with a body that dematerialized within the cloth rather than being physically removed from it. This is, of course, a statement of faith rather than a statement of science. Science cannot confirm or deny the resurrection, but the shroud provides a framework, a physical artifact around which the theological claim can be examined, discussed, and contemplated. It is also worth noting that the Catholic Church itself has maintained a carefully nuanced position on the shroud. The Church has never officially declared the shroud to be authentic. No pope has ever made an ex cathedra statement, an infallible doctrinal pronouncement, affirming that the shroud is the genuine burial cloth of Christ. But several popes have made personal statements that suggest deep reverence for the cloth. Pope Pius XI called it certainly not a human work. Pope Paul VI described it as a most important relic. Pope John Paul II, who visited the shroud during a public display in 1998, called it a mirror of the gospel and an image of God's love. Pope Benedict XVI called it an icon written in blood. And Pope Francis, during a video message broadcast during a 2013 display, called the shroud an icon of a man scourged and crucified, and spoke of it with evident devotion. None of these statements constitute an official authentication. The Church has consistently held that the shroud is a matter for science and history to determine, and that faith does not depend on the authenticity of any relic. Christians are not required to believe that the shroud is genuine. Their faith rests on the testimony of Scripture and the tradition of the Church, not on the analysis of a piece of cloth. But the Church has also not accepted the carbon dating results as the final word. In 2010, Pope Benedict XVI authorized a new round of scientific studies on the shroud, signaling that the Church considers the question of authenticity to be still open. And successive custodians of the shroud, the archbishops of Turin, have expressed willingness to allow further scientific testing, including new carbon dating, if appropriate protocols can be agreed upon. Let us consider the emotional and spiritual impact of the shroud on those who have seen it. Public displays of the shroud are rare events. They have occurred only a handful of times in the past century. The most recent displays were in 1998, 2000, 2010, and 2015. Each display drew millions of visitors to Turin. The 2010 display, for example, attracted over 2 million pilgrims over a 6-week period. Those who have seen the shroud in person describe the experience in remarkably consistent terms. They speak of a sense of awe, of silence, of being in the presence of something that transcends ordinary experience. The cloth is displayed behind bulletproof glass in a climate-controlled case in the nave of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. Visitors file past in a slow, continuous stream, pausing briefly to look at the cloth before moving on. The image in person is faint, much fainter than it appears in photographs. From a distance of a few feet, the figure is barely visible, a ghostly, straw-yellow shadow on a slightly darker background of aged linen. It is only from a greater distance that the full figure becomes apparent, resolving out of the cloth like a figure emerging from fog. Many visitors report being moved to tears. Some describe a sense of connection, a feeling that the man on the cloth is present, alive, aware. Others describe a sense of peace, of acceptance, of profound stillness. And some scientists and skeptics among them report being shaken by the experience, unable to reconcile what they see with what they believe. The shroud has this effect on people because it is not an abstract idea or a theoretical proposition. It is a physical thing. You can see it with your eyes. You can stand in its presence. If it is what believers claim it to be, then you are standing in the presence of the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, a cloth that touched his skin, absorbed his blood, and witnessed whatever happened in the tomb on the third day. If it is a forgery, then you are standing in the presence of the most extraordinary artistic achievement in human history, a work of genius so profound that even the most advanced modern science cannot explain how it was made. Either way, the shroud demands a response. It does not allow indifference. As we move toward the present day, the shroud continues to generate new research, new theories, and new controversies. In recent years, several new lines of investigation have emerged. One of the most intriguing involves the analysis of dust particles found on the shroud. Researchers have identified microscopic particles of limestone calcium carbonate on the shroud's surface. This limestone has been chemically analyzed and found to be consistent with limestone from Jerusalem, specifically from the type of limestone found in ancient tombs in the Jerusalem area. The significance of this finding is that limestone is not a common surface contaminant on European textiles. Its presence on the shroud suggests that the cloth was at some point in contact with limestone surfaces like those found in rock-cut tombs in Palestine. This is consistent with the claim that the shroud was used as a burial cloth in a Jerusalem tomb. Another recent line of investigation involves the application of advanced imaging techniques to the shroud. Digital image processing, computer enhancement, and multispectral imaging have revealed details of the cloth that were not visible through earlier methods. These techniques have allowed researchers to study the weave pattern, the blood stains, and the body image in unprecedented detail. One particularly interesting development is the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to analyze the shroud image. In 2023, researchers used neural network algorithms to generate a three-dimensional reconstruction of the face on the shroud, a reconstruction that revealed a face of remarkable specificity and individuality. The face was not generic, it was not idealized. It showed asymmetries, irregularities, and individual features consistent with a real human face, further supporting the conclusion that the image depicts a real person rather than an artist's creation. There is also an object in Oviedo, Spain, that has a significant bearing on the shroud debate. It is called the Sudarium of Oviedo, a blood-stained cloth measuring approximately 34 by 21 inches that has been kept in the Cathedral of Oviedo since the 8th century. Tradition holds that this cloth is the face cloth, the Sudarium, mentioned in the Gospel of John as being found in the empty tomb alongside the burial cloths. The Sudarium bears no image, but it does bear bloodstains. And when researchers analyzed these bloodstains and compared them with the bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin, they found a remarkable correspondence. The blood type on the Sudarium is Ob, the same as the shroud. The pattern of bloodstains on the Sudarium is consistent with a cloth that was placed over the face of a dead man, a man who had been in a vertical position, consistent with crucifixion, and who had suffered a severe injury to the right side of the face. When the Sudarium is placed over the face of the shroud and the bloodstain patterns are compared, they align. The blood flows match. The wound locations correspond. The Sudarium of Oviedo has been in documented possession in Spain since at least the 7th century, and tradition traces its history further back, through North Africa and Palestine. If the Sudarium and the shroud were in contact with the same body, as the blood evidence suggests, then the shroud must have existed before the 7th century, which is long before the carbon dating range of 1260 to 1390. This is another piece of evidence that challenges the medieval dating. And like the Prey Codex, it has never been satisfactorily addressed by those who maintain that the shroud is a medieval creation. Let us now confront, directly and honestly, the strongest arguments of the skeptics. The skeptical case against the shroud rests on several pillars. First, there is the carbon dating, the single most powerful piece of evidence for a medieval origin. Whatever challenges have been raised against the 1988 dating, the fact remains that 3 independent laboratories, using the most reliable dating technique available, all agreed on a medieval date. This is not easily dismissed. Second, there is the lack of documented history before 1354. If the shroud is authentic, it has existed for 2,000 years. Yet for the first 1,300 years of its existence, there is no unambiguous documentary evidence of its existence. The Mandylion Edessa theory provides a possible chain of custody, but it requires several unproven assumptions and identifications. The simplest explanation for the absence of documentation before 1354 is that the shroud did not exist before 1354. Third, there is the argument from probability. The medieval world was awash in fake relics. The emergence of a burial shroud of Christ in 14th century France fits the established pattern of relic fraud. Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one, suggests that the shroud is a product of its time and place, a medieval European forgery. Fourth, there is the argument that absence of a known mechanism of forgery does not prove authenticity. Just because we cannot explain how a medieval forger might have created the image does not mean that a medieval forger did not create it. Our inability to explain something is not evidence of a miracle. It is evidence of our ignorance. Future research may reveal a perfectly natural, perfectly medieval explanation for the image. These are strong arguments, and they deserve respect. The skeptical position is not unreasonable. It is supported by evidence, it is consistent with historical patterns, and it does not require any appeal to the supernatural. But the skeptical position also has weaknesses. It cannot explain the image. It cannot account for the 3-dimensional information, the photographic negativity, the superficiality, the absence of pigment, the anatomical accuracy, the forensic consistency, the intact blood clots, the double surface image, the Vignon markings in Byzantine art, the Codex illustration, the Sudarium of Oviedo correspondence, the Middle Eastern pollen, the Z-twist spinning, the Masada-style stitching, or the limestone particles from Jerusalem. Each of these facts, taken individually, might be explained away, but taken together, they form a pattern that is extraordinarily difficult to reconcile with the hypothesis of medieval forgery. A medieval forger would have had to anticipate the invention of photography, understand anatomy better than any medieval physician, possess forensic knowledge that would not exist for centuries, use real human blood of a type common in the Middle East, embed 3-dimensional distance information in a 2-dimensional image, create an image using a technique that leaves no trace of any known artistic medium, and somehow acquire pollen from Palestine, limestone from Jerusalem, and a textile woven and stitched in the manner of 1st-century Middle Eastern craftsmen. This is not impossible, but it is, to use a scientific term, highly improbable. So where does this leave us? What can we say after 700 years of debate, after decades of the most intensive scientific investigation ever applied to a single artifact, about the Shroud of Turin? We can say this: the Shroud of Turin is either the most important archaeological artifact in human history or the most sophisticated forgery ever created. There is no middle ground. It is one or the other. If it is authentic, then it is a relic of Jesus Christ, a physical remnant of the central event of the Christian faith. The blood on the cloth is his blood. The image on the cloth is his image. And the process that created the image may be the physical trace of the resurrection, the moment when, according to Christian belief, death was defeated and history was changed forever. If it is a forgery, then it was created by a person or persons of almost inconceivable genius, using techniques that remain unknown and unreproducible, incorporating knowledge that would not be available to science for centuries, and producing an artifact so convincing that it has fooled, or at least baffled, the greatest scientific minds of the modern era. Either explanation is extraordinary. Either explanation challenges our understanding of what is possible. And either explanation demands a response, not merely an intellectual response, but a personal one, because the Shroud of Turin is not just a scientific puzzle. It is not just a historical mystery. It is a question posed to every person who encounters it. It asks, what do you believe? What do you think happened in that tomb 2,000 years ago? What do you think is possible? And what would it mean for you, for your life, for the world, if the answer were different from what you expect? The shroud rests today in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. It is kept in a specially designed, climate-controlled case filled with inert argon gas to prevent further deterioration. It is monitored 24 hours a day by electronic sensors that track temperature, humidity, and atmospheric composition. It is guarded, protected, and preserved with all the care that modern technology can provide, and yet it remains vulnerable to fire, to earthquake, to the slow, inexorable forces of entropy that will eventually reduce all things to dust. The cloth is old, it is fragile, it will not last forever, but the questions it raises will last far longer than the cloth itself. Because the Shroud of Turin confronts us with the fundamental mystery of human existence, the mystery of death, the hope of resurrection, and the possibility that the boundary between the natural and the supernatural is not as firm as we might like to believe. Scientists will continue to study the Shroud. New techniques will be developed, new tests will be conducted, new data will be gathered. Perhaps someday someone will discover how the image was formed. Perhaps someone will produce a definitive dating that places the cloth either in the 1st century or the 14th century beyond any reasonable doubt. Perhaps new historical documents will surface that trace the shroud's history back to the tomb of Jesus or forward from a medieval forger's workshop, or perhaps the mystery will endure. Perhaps the shroud will continue to resist explanation, to defy categorization, to occupy the space between certainty and doubt where the deepest questions of human existence reside. The Catholic Church has called the shroud a provocation to intelligence. It is an apt description. The shroud provokes us, it challenges us. It will not leave us alone. It provokes the scientist who cannot explain the image. It provokes the historian who cannot trace its origin. It provokes the skeptic who cannot replicate it. It provokes the believer who cannot prove it. And it provokes every person who stands before it and looks into the faint, ghostly face of the man on the cloth, a face that may be the face of a medieval model, or may be the face of a 1st century carpenter from Nazareth, or may be the face of God incarnate. We do not know. After 700 years, after decades of scientific investigation, after millions of words of argument and analysis, we do not know, and perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the shroud is not meant to provide certainty. Perhaps it is meant to provoke inquiry, to inspire contemplation, to keep alive the questions that matter most. Perhaps it is a mirror, as Pope John Paul II called it, reflecting back to us not the face of Christ, but our own faces, our own hopes, our own doubts, our own deepest longings. The year is 1354. A piece of linen cloth is displayed in a small French church. On that cloth is the image of a crucified man, an image that will captivate the world, defy science, and ignite a debate that will last for centuries. The year is today. That cloth still exists. That image is still unexplained. That debate is still raging. And you who have listened to this story, you who have followed the evidence, you who have weighed the arguments, you are now part of that debate. The shroud asks its question not only of scientists and historians and theologians, it asks its question of you. What do you believe? The Shroud of Turin waits for your answer. It has been waiting for a very long time. It is in no hurry. It has all the time in the world, 14 feet of linen. An image of a man, 2,000 years of faith, 700 years of documented history, decades of scientific investigation, and a mystery, a beautiful, maddening, sublime mystery that may never be solved. This has been the story of the Shroud of Turin, the most studied artifact in human history, the most debated relic in the world, and the most profound question ever posed by a piece of cloth. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for asking the question. The mystery continues.